describe what happened in Gaza as a war. They're just participants in Israeli propaganda. There's no war in Gaza. There was a massacre in Gaza. Well, Israel has its explanation. It says, well, you know those Hamas people, those Islamic fundamentalist crazies, they were using the Palestinians as human shields. They were hiding behind the Palestinians. They were hiding inside civilian infrastructure. And so if Israel killed Palestinian civilians, well, you know, it wasn't their fault. Hamas was in fact inviting Israel to kill the civilians. They were using those Palestinians as human shields. How many of you have heard that claim that Israel is using Palestinians as human shields in Gaza? So raise your hand up high so we can see. So I think it's fair to say about 85–90%. If you haven't heard that claim, you know, maybe you're suffering from some sort of brain deficiency, or you were on mind-altering drugs because it was so widespread that it continues to this day. In fact, every human rights organization, there were about, believe it or not, there were about 300 human rights reports issued on what happened in Gaza. And all the human rights organizations, they investigated this claim of human shields. And they all reached the same conclusion. So let's take the case of the best-known human rights organization, Amnesty International. Here's what Amnesty had to say. Contrary to repeated allegations by Israeli officials of the use of human shields, Amnesty International found no evidence that Hamas or other Palestinian fighters directed the movement of civilians to shield military objectives from attacks. Amnesty International found no evidence that Hamas or other armed groups forced residents to stay in or around buildings used by fighters. Amnesty International found no evidence that fighters prevented residents from leaving buildings or areas which had been commandeered by militants. It just didn't happen. Now, about 80% of you heard the claim that Hamas engaged in human shielding. How many of you are aware that every human rights organization concluded it didn't use human shields? Raise your hand if you knew that. I'd say about 20% of the audience. And this is an informed audience, and I suspect largely an audience sympathetic to the Palestinians. But still, the ignorance is fairly widespread about what actually happened. Even if it were true that Hamas engaged in human shielding, it still couldn't explain the civilian deaths in Gaza. Why? Well, let's hear what Amnesty had to say. In the attacks that caused the greatest number of fatalities and injuries in Gaza, the victims were not caught in the crossfire of battles between Palestinian militants and Israeli forces. Well, they weren't caught in the crossfire of battles. How were they killed? Well, Amnesty says, many were killed when their homes were bombed while they slept. Others were going about their daily activities in their homes, sitting in their yard, hanging the laundry on the roof, when they were targeted in airstrikes or tank shelling. How were the children killed in Gaza? Was it because was it because Hamas was using them as human shields? Well, here's what Amnesty had to say. The children, they were studying or playing in their bedrooms or on the roof or outside their homes when they were struck by missiles or tank shells. Now, this is not to say there wasn't human shielding in Gaza. In fact, there was a lot of human shielding in Gaza. There was Israeli soldiers using Palestinians as human shields. By the end of those 22 days, according to all the human rights organizations, Israel had committed multiple war crimes and possibly or definitely crimes against humanity in Gaza. It's also true that Hamas committed comparable crimes, but obviously on an incomparably smaller scale. How many crimes can ants commit against a child, incinerating them with a magnifying glass? After the 22 days of the attack ended, the blockade of Gaza continued. But now the blockade was infinitely worse, because during the attack on Gaza, Israel purposely targeted the flour mill, the only operative flour mill. It targeted 22 of 28 cement mixing factories in Gaza. And the whole purpose was that after the invasion ended, the people of Gaza would be dependent even more on Israel for their staples like flour, and the people of Gaza would not be able to rebuild because all the cement, or 22 of the 28 cement mixing factories, were destroyed.